And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is August the 18th, 230th day of this year. Just 135 days remain to the year's over with. We'll start a new one. A lot of interesting historical facts for August 18th. 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified, guaranteed American women the right to vote. This day in 1872, Montgomery Ward issued his very first mail-order price list, a single-page sheet that launched the catalog retail industry. Growing up, the thing to look at was the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Apparently, I never heard of the internet because they've gone the way of the dodo. And in 1945, Indonesia adopted its first constitution, one day after declaring its independence. Well, let's see what stories we have in the news for this date, because there's always something interesting going on. Wasserman Schultz fights for survival in a congressional seat outside her own house. Socialist insurgency storms Trump's backyard with pro-Israel Democrats in the crosshairs. There's a high-stakes battle between the left wing and the center-left establishment of the future of the Democratic Party. It takes the spotlight today in Florida. Remember, the Democratic Socialist of America faces a more moderate incumbent Democrat who supports Israel. After attention-grabbing left-wing victories this month by Michigan's Abdul El-Sayed and Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Penny Flanagan in crucial Democratic Senate nomination showdowns, and a major setback for the DSA with the defeat of DSA member Francesca Hong in Wisconsin's Democratic gubernatorial primary. Next face-off in the party's civil war comes in Florida, which, along with Alaska and Wyoming, is holding primaries. Senate primaries in Alaska and Florida will set up crucial general election showdowns in the fight for control of the chamber. Floridians will pick the major party nominees in the race to succeed term-limited Governor Ron DeSantis. Longtime Democratic Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz is fighting for political survival against a socialist candidate in a dramatically altered congressional district. But the primary grabbing the most national attention is Florida's 25th district, where TSA endorsed Oliver Lark is challenging the more moderate Democratic Representative Jared Moskowitz in a key congressional swing district that's among roughly 24 House seats that will determine whether Republicans hold on to their razor-thin majority in the midterm elections. 33-year-old Larkin, a veteran of Sanders' 2016 Democratic presidential campaigns, the only DSA-endorsed House candidate running in a crucial congressional swing district. Larkin says he supports abolishing the Senate, arguing in a Fox News interview that it's undemocratic institutions that referred to Israel's ruling coalition as a religious supremacist regime. Moskowitz is a strong and vocal supporter of Israel and has advocated for robust U.S. military and security assistance. Well, the left wing is doing its best to take over. To win in November, Republicans need to take a page out of Obama's playbook. If history is any guide, Republicans will be in store for a beating at the ballot box in November. President Trump's average approval rating has dipped below 40%, while his disapproval rating has climbed into the high 50s. In previous elections, when presidents had approval ratings below 50%, their parties have almost always performed poorly in the midterms, and Trump's nowhere near that threshold. Congressional Republicans are not doing a whole lot better. Generic ballot shows that most midterm voters favor Democrats. Congressional disapproval soared in 2026 compared to 2025. Now sits in the high 60s. Republicans clearly need a new strategy. As strange as it might sound, one of the best models could come from their former nemesis, President Obama, who managed to pull off one of modern political history's biggest turnarounds in 2012. Many Americans have forgotten Obama's re-election was far from assured. Tea Party helped propel the Republicans to a massive midterm victory in 2010. The recovery from the 2008 financial crash was extremely sluggish. Instability was spreading overseas, and fears about government spending were widespread. And throughout 2011, Obama's approval rating remained in the low 40s and sometimes fell into the high 30s. But he turned things around in time for the 2012 presidential election by adopting two strategies that conservatives could use in 2026. And first, though many Americans were deeply unhappy with the economy in 2012, the Obama administration successfully persuaded millions of voters that their economic problems had been inherited from George W. Bush administration. The argument America couldn't afford to return to the failed policies, in his view, caused the 2008 crash. Of course, his account conveniently ignored that many of those policies have been strongly supported by Democrats in Congress, but the political strategy did work. The Obama argued Americans couldn't afford to do it. The message became one of the centerpieces of Obama's campaign. His team even adopted "Forward" as an official campaign slogan. Republicans have an obvious opportunity to make a similar case today. They inherited one of the worst inflation crises in decades when it took power in 2025. Housing costs and the prices of most consumer goods skyrocketed under Democratic rule for numerous reasons, including reckless spending, unnecessary lockdown and stimulus programs, supply chain problems, and the Biden administration's obsession with costly green energy sources. And we'll see what these midterms bring. Well, Penn State cocaine bust nets 14 arrests over alleged pledge coke-cutting indoctrination rituals. More than a dozen Penn Staters are charged in connection with an alleged massive cocaine distribution ring, and one of the alleged ringleaders, Agostino Abatiello, 24, Westbury, New York, remains at large. Pennsylvania Attorney General Dave Sunday announced that Abatiello was among 14 people who are facing charges related to the coke trafficking operation, where students and two off-campus fraternities were allegedly involved. In all, 13 defendants were Penn State University students at or around the time of the alleged conduct in 2023 and 2024. The 14th defendant, the father of the students, charged with tampering with evidence and hindering the investigation, according to the Attorney General's office. In the Monday announcement, the Attorney General said suspects Abatiello and Thomas Robinson are the main coke suppliers. They allegedly made regular trips to Philadelphia and New York to pick up large quantities of the illegal drug. Members of the Delta Upsilon and Sigma Chi fraternities allegedly cut and packaged the coke inside their frat houses off campus and distributed it to Penn State students. The AG said in addition to the charges against alleged ringleaders, Abatiello and Robinson, two more, Mohammed Hirabi and Lars Zipat, are charged with felony corrupt organization and conspiracy dealing in the proceeds of unlawful activity and related offenses. Additionally, Robert Zanolo is charged with felony conspiracy and criminal use of a communication facility and related misdemeanors. Well, we'll see if the university recovers from that. Oprah has distanced herself from Trump allies Dr. Phil and Dr. Oz, says they have not one thing to do with me. Talk show legend Oprah Winfrey distanced herself from Dr. Phil McGraw and Dr. Mehmet Oz, two stars she helped turn into national media personalities who have since become associated with conservative policies. She spoke to Emmy Magazine about her career and was asked how she felt about McGraw and Oz now. She said, "People criticize me for Dr. Phil and Dr. Oz because of their policies, their views," she said, recalling that during a lengthy legal battle in the late 90s, Dr. Phil, so practical, so down-to-earth, and so real, and he'd ride in the car with her every morning on the way to trial, where she literally was sitting on trial for 6 weeks. Dr. McGraw and Oz have become political figures in recent years. Oz, endorsed by President Trump, ran for U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania in 2022 before being defeated by Senator John Fetterman. McGraw's not endorsed either party. He appeared at Trump's Madison Square Garden campaign rally in October 2024 and accompanied ICE personnel during Chicago immigration raids alongside Trump border czar Tom Homan. Oz was nominated by Trump, approved by the Senate to become administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in 2025 as the president returned to office. She said, I felt he was so instrumental in helping me. I thought, oh, you could help a lot of people. You should come on my show. For Dr. Oz, she said he explained practical things like colon cancer and bowel movements. I thought he had the language for explaining medical things in a way that was helpful to me. I thought it'd be helpful to many other people, and that's how they ended up on the show. And everybody has their own path in life, and it's not one thing to do with me, and I don't have one thing to do with them. At the time, the reason and intention behind me giving them their breaks was I thought they had valuable information to share that had been meaningful to me. Well, the managing editor of Media Research Center's Newsbusters, Curtis Houck, told Fox News Digital that Winfrey appears to have no qualms about engaging in politics herself. Well, we'll see if she does. A Virginia man acquitted by insanity and killing flees the U.S. during a 48-hour mental health pass. Virginia man found not guilty by reason of insanity in a 2019 killing fled the U.S. on a one-way flight to Tajikistan while on an approved 48-hour pass from a state mental health facility, according to court records. Abdullah Tashpula Dozota left the Northern Virginia Mental Health Institute on July 6 for an authorized 48-hour pass. He was required to return in 2 days later, but never did, according to Fox 5, citing court documents. Instead, he traveled to Washington Dulles International Airport and boarded a Turkish Airlines flight to Istanbul before continuing to Dushanbe, Tajikistan, according to documents show. He failed to return to NVMHI on July 8, 2026 as required, the filing states. He was committed to the custody of the Virginia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services in 2022 after being found not guilty by reason of insanity in the death of his landlord, Mohammed Emashin, according to Fox 5. His departure came shortly after a judge determined he remained mentally ill and needed inpatient treatment. Well, unfortunately, for everybody concerned, he made his getaway. The Institute approved him to leave on July 6. Court records show he left the approved placement and headed to Dulles instead of returning to the facility. And unfortunately for everybody, he got out of the country. Well, SCOTUS urgently allowed construction at the White House to proceed. SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States. Because of extremely unfortunate, inexplicable, and reckless decision by two lower courts, U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Roberts has before him an application for a stay of an order from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, which order opposed the imposition of a Rococo construction schedule for the above-ground construction of the new east wing of the White House. When it was ordered by U.S. District Judge Richard Leon's micromanagement of what can and cannot be built in the replacement structure to now demolish the old east wing of the White House. An east wing that was built in 1902 and expanded in 1942 when FDR had it substantially expanded and added underground facilities that included the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. An 84-year-old emergency center is, of course, outdated. Well, Judge Leon and the Circuit Court have directed President Trump what he can and can't build on the grounds of the Executive Mansion. And he's been a fine judge for his long tenure. He's appointed by President Bush in 2002 and assumed senior status in 2016. But even the best judges throw a spanner every now and then, and this order's one of them, according to legal experts. Judge Naomi Rao, maybe the most brilliant intellect in the D.C. Circuit, issued a comprehensive dissent to the rambling wreck of the Circuit Court's lengthy opinion. Department of Justice asked the Chief Justice to stay the order of the Circuit Court, and including Judge Leon's order. Well, we'll see what comes of it, if anything. Well, CNN fires back at the Trump White House over attacks on a reporter, calls him beneath the office. CNN fired back at the White House on Monday after President Trump's rapid response team took aim at CNN White House correspondent Kristen Holmes. While Trump took questions from the Oval Office, Holmes asked him for his reaction to viral comments made by Senator John Ossoff, Republican of Georgia, who claimed Trump could either build a ballroom and travel with White House aide Natalie Hart and do his job as president, which Trump replied by calling him Pee Wee Herman. Rapid Response 47 account on X slammed Holmes for invoking Ossoff's jab, which fueled online fodder for liberal critics pushing unfounded claims of an inappropriate relationship between Trump and Hart. Well, Trump is always going to be a target for the left-wing media. And unfortunately, that kind of overshadows a lot of his activities. The DOJ opens a probe into a prestigious college over an alleged discrimination favoring minority students. Department of Justice launched an investigation on Monday into the College of William & Mary to determine whether certain scholarships and student benefits at the Virginia-based public research institution include unlawful race-based criteria, adding to the Trump administration's targeting of educational institutions across the country. DOJ's Civil Rights Division announced it was opening a compliance review for the college's potential violation of the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. I will say that a couple of civil rights complaints I filed were just dismissed out of hand without any comment. And then I was told that a former attorney general said that the civil rights laws could only be used for minority students, not for non-minority students, which in and of itself I thought was discriminatory. Hayden Panettiere, Heroes and Nashville actress, is dead at age 36. No cause of death was announced for her death.
Are the ones who find answers.
What's that?
Questions are everything.
A lot of strange sounds this morning. Well, she began her career as a child actor in commercials and soap operas before she propelled fame as a cheerleader with superpowers in the TV series Heroes in 2006. Survived by her daughter Kaya, who was born in 2014 with Ukrainian boxer Vladimir Klitschko. Panettiere's younger brother Jensen is also an actor, died of a heart condition in 2023 at the age of 28. And she wrote a haunting line about her last breath in her memoir. She reflected on life and growth and mortality in the prologue to her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning. The book, released in May of 2026, chronicled her life in the public eye, as well as her struggles with alcohol and addiction and mental health after rising to fame as a teenager. She said, I never want to stop evolving and changing for the better, and I'll forever be a work in progress, she wrote. But one thing I know from my 36 years in the public eye is this: life is a process that evolves day by day, year by year, and like it or not, you're engaged in a cycle of growth to the moment you take your last breath. Well, that passage has taken on a poignant new meaning after her death on the 16th. Well, Kushner gives Hamas a stark ultimatum. Disarm or Israel gets U.S. backing to finish the job. U.S. Special Envoy Jared Kushner delivered a stark ultimatum to Hamas on Monday, warning that the terrorist group has to honor its commitments to disarming Gaza or face an Israeli military operation to finish the job. Speaking exclusively to Fox News, Chief Foreign Correspondent Trey Yingst, Kushner also detailed high-stakes diplomatic meetings in Egypt and Israel over the last 48 hours aimed at advancing President Trump's Gaza peace roadmap as fighting and disagreements between Israel and Hamas persist. Israel has carried out airstrikes and seized more territory in Gaza despite an October ceasefire, where Hamas has refused to give up its weapons, Reuters reported on Monday. Kushner first met with Hamas in Cairo, together with the National Committee, the new technocratic Palestinian government that's going to take over control. Kushner told the Yanks that the group reaffirmed its commitment to Trump's 20-point peace plan and the 15-point roadmap we've been working on with them for the last 4 months, where they commit to give up their weapons. They just haven't done it yet. Well, WNBA fans recall ejection threat over XXXY athletic shirt at the Fever Dream game. The fans said they were flabbergasted. Casey Thompson and her daughter Annie recalled on Monday being threatened with an ejection from a game between the Indiana Fever and the Atlanta Dream if they refused to cover up their XXXY athletic shirts in the crowd. They said on Fox News channels, the Ingram angle, they were approached by a security guard at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, asking them to change the shirts in favor of a Dream t-shirt. Casey said the security guard wasn't even sure why he was being told to ask him to remove the shirts, but he was, and he did. He didn't know what was offensive about it. He said he didn't even understand, but since somebody told them about their shirts and claimed they were offensive, they had to cover them up, put on our Atlanta Dream shirts instead of our XXXY. Annie said she was flabbergasted the first time she experienced anything like that. Just had no words except who's offended by that t-shirt at this point. And the WNBA released a statement about the incident on Monday. WNBA is aware of interactions at last night's game in Atlanta in which fans were asked by league security to cover up their t-shirts. League spokesman said this should not have happened, but unfortunately it did, which just made it even worse. Well, on that note, let's talk about today's topic. We're still talking about a lot of unknown victims of Jack the Ripper. In those days, hospitals were frightening places. When Emma Smith, who had been found unconscious in the streets, finally did reach the 18 George Street, she's met by Mary Russell, the deputy keeper. Deputy keeper was the assistant, the manager of the apartment house she lived in. The several of the lodgers, to include one named Annie Lee, said that Smith's face was bleeding, ear was cut, in distress, in need of hospital treatment. So the women that met her decided to take her to the London Hospital on Whitechapel Road, half a mile away. Smith was unwilling to go, maybe because she was in so much agony she didn't want to walk, or maybe she knew she'd be asked questions, or maybe she was afraid to go to the hospital, because it was a frightening place, as I said. Dr. Frederick Treves was surgical registrar and assistant surgeon at the London Hospital, later became surgeon and head of the School of Anatomy. He's maybe best known today for his association with the Elephant Man, Joseph Carey Merrick. He gave Elephant Man a home in the London Hospital. When he talked later about that hospital, he said, the poor people in those days hated it. They looked on it primarily as a place where people went to die. Matter of difficulty to induce a patient to enter the wards. They feared an operation, and with good cause, for an operation then was a dubious matter. There were stories floating around about things that happened in the hospital, and it couldn't be gainsaid that certain of those stories were actually true. But despite Smith's misgivings, two of the women struggled to get her to the hospital. And incidentally, on the way to the hospital past a waxwork that would soon become home to models of Jack the Ripper's victims. And she was attended by a doctor by the name of Haslip. But unfortunately, it was determined nothing could be done for her, and she died of peritonitis at 9 a.m. on April 4th. An inquest was held at the hospital by Wynn Baxter and the coroner, and the coroner's jury returned a verdict of willful murder. Only Walter Dew seemed to have believed that Emma Smith was murdered by Jack the Ripper. General opinion was she had been attacked by one or more of a gang of men who were in the habit of frequenting the streets in the late hours of night and levying blackmail on women. There were several murder groups at play in those days, in addition to Jack the Ripper. Street gangs are an almost forgotten feature of the violent landscape of Victorian society. But throughout the 1880s, gangs terrorized the streets, violently attacking and robbing people. There were certain areas that were considered no-go areas, and the laws really didn't apply there. And these gangs became a major problem in the big cities of Victorian Britain. Manchester had the scuttling gangs like Buffalo Bill's gang and the Bengal Tigers and the Bungle Boys and 40 Row. Birmingham had the Peaky Blinders. They got that name because of their caps worn low over the face, both as a fashion statement and keep people from recognizing them, but also allegedly with razor blades sewn into the peaks to make the caps into weapons themselves. London had the Hooligans, the Regent's Park Gang, the curiously named Monkeys Parade Gang in Bow, and the Plaid Cap Brigade in Plaistow. Various books also mention the so-called Hoxton High Rips and the Hoxton Market Gangs and the Limehouse 40 Thieves. Gangs also often named in the books about Jack the Ripper, and even some of the East End histories are being responsible for killing Emma Smith was the Old Nickel Gang. It was a notorious area. The Old Nickel was a notorious area of the East End. It was mired in criminality. Almost inconceivable that the area didn't have a gang at the time. But the area's references to one would appear to be by a later gang leader named Arthur Harding, who wrote that a gang member named William Billy Newman was one of the Old Nickel mob. They were a crooked family. Whether or not such a gang did exist in 1888, there appears to be no contemporary newspaper references attributing the murder of Emma Smith to the Old Nickel Gang. The idea seemed to originate with a 1959 book by Donald McCormick. So even during the time that Jack the Ripper held sway, there was confusion about which were his victims and which were not. At the time of Annie Chapman's murder in September of 1888, the newspaper reported the police have no theory about respect to the matter, except the sort of high rip gang existing in the neighborhood, which blackmailing women who frequented the streets, takes vengeance on those who don't have money for them. The high rip theory made it into a remarkable fictional Penny Dreadful serial entitled The Whitechapel Murder, or The Mysteries of the East End, published in weekly installments at the very time the Whitechapel murders were actually being committed. And in the serial, a detective named Richard Ryder is taken to a low pub in East End to meet Red Rip, the leader of the High Rip gang, and after infiltrating that gang, he concludes that they have no connection with the murders. Well, it's interesting to note that even at the time the murders were taking place, folks who interacted with the gangs weren't sure which ones they were doing and which ones were done by the indisputable Jack the Ripper. Now, the original High Rip gang was a street gang of infamous reputation. It terrorized Liverpool between 1884 and 1886. But to this day, it's disputed whether there was ever a large unified gang called the High Rip, or whether the name, whatever its origins, was applied to and maybe adopted by diverse and unrelated gangs. The High Rip gang is sometimes linked with the brutal murder of Richard Morgan in Liverpool's Tithbarn Street on Bank Holiday Monday, August 3rd, 1874. But in fact, that murder is more correctly attributed to what were known as corner men, groups of criminals who loafed around street corners begging and intimidating passers-by, to get money for drink, and occasionally running prostitutes for the same purpose. In reality, the High Rip first came to public attention with the infamous Blackstone murder of January 5th, 1884. Now, Liverpool's Blackstone Street Gang was a notorious group of young men who terrorized our neighborhood. Came to citywide and national prominence when it set upon Exquel Rodriguez Nunez, a 34-year-old Spanish sailor who was returning to his vessel in Huskisson Dock. The corner of Blackstone Street was a gang of young men, one of whom punched Nunez's companion in the mouth as they passed by. The shocked man made for the docks, but Nunez turned and ran in the opposite direction, pursued by the gang. He slipped and fell, and the gang descended on him, beating him mercilessly with their belts. He twice managed to escape the gang, but was eventually cornered and knifed several times. The police eventually caught up with the gang members, but conflicting evidence from assorted witnesses, many of whom were relatives of the accused, led to the acquittal of all but two. Patrick Dugan and Michael McLean were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Dugan's sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and McLean went to the gallows the morning of March 11, 1884. The Blackstone Street Gang wasn't originally identified as the High Rip. It was simply called the Blackstone Street Gang. But a year or so later, Patrick Mannion appeared in the magistrate's court, charged with having broken into the home of Thomas Doyle and having struck him in the head with his belt buckle. Mannion was described as a member of the High Rip Gang, which hung around Blackstone Street. The stipendiary magistrate, Mr. Raffles, a man of considerable experience, asked the meaning of the term High Rip, which suggests it was relatively new. Policeman explained that was what the gang shouted whenever a policeman approached. Late as 1897, the High Rip Gang was making the national newspapers. The Times, in December of that year, reported that Richard Owens, a 20-year-old laborer, had been found guilty of wounding Peter Montgomery. Owens was said to be a member of the High Rip Gang, but to this day, it's disputed whether any such gang actually really existed. Chief Constable of Liverpool, Sir John William Knott Bower, claimed it did not. Well, part of the problem is the powers that be wanted to downplay the existence of all the gangs because it made the area look bad. So you don't know what the truth and what's not. This condition of affairs caused a lot of concern and anxiety, and unfortunately some genius invented an absolutely unfounded cause for it. An invention that would seem to take the fancy of the press, which exploited it to the extent which caused considerable alarm and comment. It was suggested that a large number of crimes of violence in the Scotland Division was due to the work of an organized gang, banded together for purposes of plunder and violence and exacting vengeance on all who ventured to give evidence against them or interfere with their nefarious work. And not content with inventing the organization, the most euphonious name for it was also invented, and it was stated the organization was known as the High Rip Gang, and of course all that's created considerable and entirely unjustifiable alarm, though it was never the very faintest shadow of a foundation for the suggestions made. Letters from all sorts of irresponsible people, press comment, and a certain sort of public opinion assumed that the impossible and accepted the fact of a High Rip Gang. It was impossible, for such a gang could not have existed without the police ever hearing about it, and circumstances of the various crimes were such as to render it impossible to assign them to such a cause. But for long, the ridiculous scare continued to be boomed until Mr. Justice Day, in charge of the grand jury at the assizes, scotched it, and gradually discussion of the High Rip Gang ceased. On the other hand, the reputation of Judge Sir John Charles Day was built largely on the claim that he was responsible for suppression of the gang in the 1880s through the imposition of stiff prison sentences with flogging. What really distinguished High Rippery, which was so terrifying about it, and was the gang's willingness to engage in random and often completely unprovoked acts of vicious violence and murder. That's what the police meant when they attributed the early Whitechapel murders to a sort of High Rip Gang, namely a gang that engaged in motiveless savagery. It was quite possible an early theory was the inspiration for the name Jack the Ripper, which was first used in a letter sent to the Central News Agency and was properly attributed to a journalist. And it does make sense, Jack the Ripper coming from the High Rip Gang. There's a certain connection there. Well, let's talk about another victim, Martha Tabram, August 7th, 1888. That was the August Bank Holiday Monday in 1888. Unseasonably cold. Organizers of entertainments across London eyed the leaden skies with concern. But fortunately, the rain held off, and a brief appearance by the sun encouraged the crowds to descend on the various venues offering holiday attractions. 21,000 people went to the Zoological Gardens and Regent's Park, 14,000 to the Tower of London, 12,000 to the South Kensington Museums, nearly 8,000 to the Natural History Museum, and 7,000 people visited the state apartments in Windsor Castle. In the East End, 26,000 people gathered to see the Duchess of Albany open an art exhibit at the People's Palace. But the biggest draws that day were the spectacular entertainments at Crystal Palace and Alexandra Palace. Over 56,000 people went to Crystal Palace, that momentous greenhouse originally built for the Great Exhibition of 1851. And in 1888, the centerpiece of a sort of theme park providing a popular mixture of indoor and outdoor entertainments. That day, the events included an organ recital, a promenade concert, a performance of the ballet Midsummer Night's Dream, and in the evening, a balloon ascent by Captain William Duncan Dale. Watching people go up in a balloon was a big attraction in the 80s, and Dale regularly appeared at the Crystal Palace. He made 200 ascents and was considered a huge crowd puller. His career ended tragically June 30th, 1892, when his balloon, having reached 600 feet, was seen to deflate suddenly, a large rent having developed near the top part of the silk. And witnesses said it felt like a rag, and the 4 occupants of the basket frantically threw everything of weight over the side, even ripping the metal buttons off their jackets. But unfortunately, their efforts made no difference, and the basket hit the ground with a sickening thud, killed Dale and his passengers. But on this August bank holiday, nothing went wrong, and Captain Dale safely made his ascent to the great awe of the assembled public. And afterwards, there was a firework display by Brock's, the oldest fireworks company in Britain, centerpiece depicting the destruction of the Spanish Armada. Established in the early 18th century by John Brock in Islington, Brock's became so closely associated with Crystal Palace that for a while the company called its products C.T. Brock and Company's Crystal Palace Fireworks. The other big draw that day was Alexandra Palace, where 50,000 people passed through the turnstiles to enjoy a similar program that included organ recitals by Mr. Henderson and flying trapeze feats by some Russian gymnast called the Cleo Troupe, a dramatic farce called Current Cash, and 3 performances of a military tournament featuring over 30 men and horses at the Royal Horse Artillery. In the evening, a crowd watched mesmerized as Professor Baldwin went a step further than Captain Dale by going up in his balloon and parachuting to the ground. Our display afterwards was described as scenic and pyrotechnic extravaganza that depicted the last days of Pompeii. The evening also offered special performances included by the Mohawk Minstrels at the 3,000-seat St. Mary's Hall attached to the Agricultural Hall in Islington. The Mohawks, renowned for their sentimental songs and high-level humor, were usually popular and performed to capacity audiences well into the 20th century, subsequently going into decline in the face of slicker entertainment. In 1888, they were at the peak of their popularity, and the crowd that quayed in the street to get in far exceeded the hall's capacity. And those who managed to get seats had a great evening, and were especially appreciative of a comic song called Troubles at the Picnic. By contrast, the audience had turned out to see the opening night of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at the Opera Comique off the Strand went home less than happy, although apparently they laughed as loudly and as heartily as those watching the Mohawks, although for different reasons. 2 actor-managers, Daniel Bandman and Richard Mansfield, had recently come to London with rival productions of Jekyll and Hyde. Mansfield had piped Bandman to the post by opening on the Saturday night, when he won acclaim for his transformation from Jekyll into Hyde. His Bandman's turn to open on the Monday bank holiday night, but his production was a flop. His transformation into Hyde consisted of little more than putting in false teeth and slipping on a wig while the house lights were dimmed. And as the Times put it, he hopped about the stage after the manner of a kangaroo, emitting a wheezing sound like a broken-winded horse. The Daily News preferred to liken Bandman's hopping to that of a galvanized frog. The audience laughed out loud, it said, and unseemly tittering even accompanied a murder. It was about 6 p.m., a couple of hours before the curtain went up on Bandman's disaster, that the rain started to come down. It was just a drizzle at first, but it grew harder before turning into a downpour that continued for hours. People scurried home as if they had one to scurry off to, or made their way to the theaters and music halls, or took shelter in a pub for a sing-song around a battered piano. Many people braved the cold and the wet that night, and one of them was Martha Tabram. She was born May 10th, 1849, at 17 Marshall Street and London Road in Southwark, the youngest of 5 children born to warehouseman Charles Samuel White and his wife Elizabeth Dowsett White. Her eldest brother Henry was 12 when she was born. Then came Esther, who was 10, Stephen, who was 8, Marianne, who was 3. Her parents separated around the year 1865, and Martha, who was 5 foot 3 inches with dark hair and a dark complexion, took up with a man called Henry Samuel Tabron. At the time of her death, was described as short, well-dressed man with still gray hair and mustache and imperial beard, and he was employed as a foreman packer at a furniture warehouse in Deptford. They married at Trinity Church in St. Mary's Parish in Newington on Christmas Day, 1869. In February 1871, their son Frederick John was born, followed in December the following year by Charles Henry. But the marriage, of course, soon ran into trouble, apparently because Martha was a drunk. In 1875, her husband had enough of her behavior and left. Well, Martha sounds like a bit of a fighter. She took out a warrant for Henry Tabram's arrest for desertion, and he was brought up before the magistrate, and Mr. Benson. He explained his wife's intemperate habits were the cause of the desertion, but nevertheless agreed to give her 12 shillings a week. That's very nearly 50 pounds in today's money, which he appears to have paid regularly for 3 years. But Martha wasn't satisfied with that sum and began accosting Henry in the street, demanding more money from him. He finally responded by reducing the payment to about 10 pounds. Martha retaliated by having a warrant taken out against him, so Henry was again arrested and locked up and forced to renew payments in the full amount. Eventually, though, he learned that Martha had taken up with another man, where he flatly refused to support her any longer. Doesn't seem Martha took any further action against him. She apparently had no further contact with him. He did see her in the street occasionally, the last time being in Whitechapel Road about 18 months before she died. And to nobody's surprise, she was drunk at the time. It was Martha's belief her wooded sister-in-law, Anne Morris, had encouraged Henry to leave her. Accordingly, she embarked on a campaign against Ms. Morris, which escalated to the point where on one occasion she broke all that woman's windows. Anne Morris, who was described as a very respectable woman living at 23 Lisbon Street and Cambridge Heath Road, brought charges against Martha, who was sentenced to 7 days' hard labor. At that point, Martha abandoned her campaign. By 1879, she began living with William Turner, sometime carpenter at the time of the murder, was hawking cheap trinkets such as menthol cones and needles and pins. Described as short, dirty, and dressed in a slovenly manner, he had a pale face and a fair imperial mustache. Despite his unkempt appearance, he was very good to Tabram and had helped to support her 2 children. But he told the inquest his relationship with her was troubled by her excessive drinking, and they frequently separated. He said, if I give her money, she generally spent it on drink. In fact, it was always drink. But they lived together at various addresses to about April and May of 1888, when they rented a room in the house of Mary Boosfield, wife of a woodcutter named William Boonsfield, at 4 Star Place, a narrow, grimy cul-de-sac off Star Street. Commercial road, which was pitted with potholes half full of murky water. And at the end of Star Street was a thriving corner pub, while squalid shops that had been converted from front living rooms ran its length, selling fruit and coal and cat's meat and assorted other goods. And it's usual for people to play down the frivolities of the dead, for whom one generally speaks no ill. Accordingly, it's common to find witnesses playing down the faults of Jack the Ripper's victims, but in doing that, you have to read between the lines. Henry Tabram left his wife because of her drinking. William Turner was of the opinion that Martha was a troublesome drunk. His drinking caused several separations during their relationships, and Mary Boosfield at the inquest was nervous and very indistinct and rambling in her remarks, said she had never seen Tabram drunk, and it was certainly a woman who would rather have a glass of ale than a cup of tea. She was, according to Boosfield, a very retiring woman and probably didn't know 2 people in the street. And as far as she knew, Tabram had never brought home any man and earned her living by selling matches and other trinkets in the street. Well, Tom Cullen, who was author of Autumn of Terror, spoke to 83-year-old James Boosfield, the son of Martha Tabram's one-time landlady, who showed him a keychain, one of the trinkets that Tabram often hawked, which he had retained as a souvenir after the murder. About 2 weeks before her death, Turner had left Martha and taken lodgings at the Victoria Working Man's Home on Commercial Street. He last saw her alive August 4th in Leadenhall Street, where he'd given her £1 to buy trinkets to trade. Martha briefly stayed on at 4 Star Place, but she absconded, owing Miss Boosfield money. A while later, she came back, forced to London, and occupied the room for one night without Boosfield knowing she was there. leaving the key behind the next morning. And Martha moved into a common lodging house at 19 George Street in Spitalfields, using the name of Emma and trying to earn a living by selling her trinkets in the street, or by selling herself up dark alleys or anywhere else that offered a modicum of privacy. The prostitute, known by the nickname Pearly Paul and Mog, Mary Ann Connolly, was described rather unflatteringly in the press as a big, masculine-looking woman with a husky voice and a face rattled by drink. The admissions records of the Whitechapel Infirmary contain several entries of a Mary Ann Connolly who was successfully admitted between April and August of 1888 for laryngitis, bronchitis, and melalgia. She was discharged after her last treatment August 4th, 3 days prior to the murder. She was age 35 and told police her address was 19 George Street, where Tabram also lived. The ailments of which she suffered may have accounted for her deep, husky voice. Connolly told the police she met Martha Tabram about 10 p.m. on the bank holiday night. It was August 6th, according to a report in East London Observer. Two soldiers, a private and a corporal, had accosted him in Whitechapel Road and asked him to go for a drink in a nearby pub, a request to which the women readily acceded. Connolly initially claimed that she and Tabram stayed in front of the pub drinking with the soldiers till about 11:45 that evening, but at the inquest she said they had gone on a bit of a pub crawl. It's difficult to know what story is true, but at about 11 p.m., Tabram was seen by her sister-in-law, Ms. Mary Ann Norris, standing alone on the curb outside the White Swan pub at 20 Whitechapel High Street. Tabram was alone at that time, and that may cast some doubt on Connolly's story, although it's possible that Connolly and the soldiers had already gone inside, and for that, Tabram was waiting outside for him to come back. And if that's the case, it's likely that Connolly's claim that they went on a pub crawl is true, and that the foursome ended up or went on from the White Swan. Connolly said at some point she had had an argument with the corporal, and he hit her with a stick, but the road didn't stop the evening progressing toward its probably inevitable conclusion, with one of the soldiers suggesting the couples pair off. He duly left the pub at about 11:45, and Connolly watched Tabram turn into a narrow passage called George Yard, before she headed off with the corporal toward a secluded spot a few doors along called Angel Alley. Said she'd never see Martha Tabram alive again. Now, George Yard was entered from Whitechapel High Street through a covered archway next to a pub called the White Hart. It wasn't actually a yard, but a narrow street that went to Wentworth Street. About 1875, a significant clearance of slums in the street led to the construction of George Yard buildings by a local philanthropist by the name of Crowther. It was sufficiently impressive to have been visited soon after by Princess Alice, the second daughter of Queen Victoria. Located in the northwest corner of George Yard, back and on to Toynbee Hall in 1888, the buildings were inhabited by people of the poorest description, two of them being Joseph and Elizabeth Mahoney. Joseph was employed as a carman, delivery driver, and his wife Elizabeth, a young woman of 25 or 26, worked in a match factory at Stanford from 9 a.m. until 7 p.m. They'd been out all day with friends and got home at about 1:40 in the morning. One of the rules of the building was that all the lights illuminating the stairway were turned off promptly at 11. So they were wearily picking their way to their rooms. The stairs had been in pitch blackness for some time. They got to their lodgings, and Elizabeth took off her hat and cloak and returned down the stairs to the streets to fetch some provisions for supper from a chandler's shop in Thurl Street. She was gone about 5 minutes, coming back without seeing anything suspicious. She and her husband had their meal and went to bed. They claimed they didn't hear anything unusual during the night. But the Eastern Post and City Chronicle reported that John Saunders Reeves, a 33-year-old dock and Riverside laborer, and his wife Louisa of 37 George Yard buildings had heard several fights in Wentworth Street and George Street that night. The first one, they said, was about 11:30 in the evening. Then the second around an hour later when they heard cries of police and help and terrible screaming. The third fight began shortly after 1 in the morning, when there were again terrible screams. The Reeves apparently went on to their balcony and saw two separate rows going on, one close to the house in George Street where Tabram and Pearly Paul sometimes lodged, and the other in Wentworth Street. At the entrance to Angel Alley, in a house that Pearly Paul was said to have visited that evening. Both fights attracted quite large crowds before they were broken up by the police. According to the newspaper, the police on the various beats in the area confirmed that there had been several disturbances, and repeated screams and cries for help were heard at midnight and during the early hours of the morning. At 2 in the morning, P.C. Thomas Barrett saw a Grenadier Guardsman near Wentworth Street and entrance to George Yard. Soldier between 22 and 26 was about 5'6" in height and had a fair complexion with dark hair and a small brown mustache turned up at the ends. Had one good conduct badge and no medals. Barrett asked the man why he was loitering in the street, and the soldier replied he had waiting for a mate who had gone with a girl. About 3:30 in the morning, a young man in his early 20s named Alfred George Crow, who lived at 35 George Street, George Yard buildings, went up the same stairs as Elizabeth Mahoney. Cab driver with closely cropped hair and a beardless, intelligent face. He noticed a body lying on the first floor landing. Didn't pay too much attention. It's not uncommon to find drunks and homeless folks sleeping on the landing. It wasn't until 4:50 in the morning when John Saunders Reeves left his room to go to work that the light of the early dawn revealed the body to be that of a woman lying in a pool of blood. Reeves, who was a short man with a close-cut dark beard and mustache and wearing earrings, was naturally alarmed at the sight, particularly as his wife Louise had been plagued throughout the night by a deep sense of foreboding. She'd woken up several times under an apprehension that something was about to happen. Such was her alarm that at one point John got up and listened at the front door for any uncommon sounds. As he looked at the body, he remembered his wife's alarm and feared to tell her in case she fainted. Whether Miss Reeves did experience a premonition or whether it was a colorful piece of elaboration never be known, but John Reeves probably would have been anxious about telling London of his discovery, as she was 8 months pregnant, the couple's 5th child, Harriet Elizabeth Reeves, who was born on September 12th. Reeves ran for a policeman and returned a short time later with P.C. Thomas Barrett, who took one look at the body and immediately sent Reeves to fetch Dr. Timothy Keeling from his home on Brick Lane. Dr. Keeling arrived at 5:30 in the morning and quickly examined the body, making a more thorough examination later in the day. Martha Tabor had been a victim of a frenzied attack, stabbed in the breast, in the stomach, the abdomen, and the vagina 39 times. Apparently it was done with an ordinary penknife, although a wound on the chest bone, which had penetrated the sternum, could have been made by a dagger or a sword bayonet. Keeling thought all the wounds, with one possible exception, had been made by a right-handed man, and estimated that Tabor had died at about 2:30 in the morning from hemorrhage and loss of blood. Dr. Keeling was certain about one other matter of significance, though. There's a lot of blood between Tabor's separated legs and no sign that she had recently had sex. It's always possible Keeling missed the traces, particularly if Tabor had devised a way of simulating intercourse without penetration actually taking place. Otherwise, either Tabor and soldier companion had not managed to perform, or he had killed her without attempting sex, or he wasn't a murderer at all. According to Pearlie Paul, she and Tabor separated a little after 11:45 p.m. Dr. Keeling estimated Tabor had died about 2:30 in the morning. These times are even remotely accurate, then Tabor most certainly was not murdered by her soldier companion. That meant she may possibly have been murdered by the companion of the soldier P.C. Barrett spoke to at 2 in the morning, although as far as anybody knows, that soldier never specified his mate had gone down George Yard. Also, assuming that George Yard buildings were not where Tabor habitually took her customers, would she have hung around in that area for 2.5 hours? The timing raised questions. If Keeling was in the least bit correct, Connolly's timings must have been way out, or taking the timings together with Keeling's belief Tabor had not had sex. I have to wonder if Connolly's story was even true. Well, it seems that Martha Tabor had been taken completely by surprise. She was given no opportunity or time to call for help or otherwise cry out. Francis Hewitt, the superintendent of George Yard building, and his wife occupied a room close to where Martha's body was found. He measured the distance for a journalist. It was about 12 feet from the murder scene. And he said, "We never heard a cry." Ms. Hewitt added that early in the evening a single cry of murder had echoed through the building, but she didn't think it had come from inside it. Cries of murder were quite frequent in that area. In due course, Martha Tabor's mortal remains were placed on a police ambulance and taken to the mortuary, where on August 8th they were photographed. A description was circulated to 116 infirmaries. Well, there is a popular image of late Victorian society as ordered and secure, prim and proper, well-mannered and graceful. It was and is an image fostered by many, but is in reality a veneer that barely hid an underbelly of appalling heartlessness, vice and brutality, the nastiness which was shoved into corners such as the East End and kept at a distance, hidden and largely ignored, its existence barely recognized. Victorian society was a room that looked tidy, but had all the clutter shoved into a cupboard. The fear was that it would fall out all at once if the door was open. The policemen of J and H divisions, which covered much of the East End, were hardened by exposure to the poverty, misery, crime, and immortality of the East End. But even they were shocked and horrified by the frenzied attack on Martha Tabor. One remarked to a journalist, "No crime more brutal has ever been committed in the East End than the one in George Yard buildings." The crime generated more press interest than the assault on Emma Smith, and the police investigation led by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed, head of the local CID, was widely followed. Inspector Reed faced an almost impossible task. He was hampered at the outset by problems in identifying Tabor. She thought to be no fewer than 4 different people. According to the East London Observer, the difficulty in identification arose out of the brutal treatment to which the deceased had manifestly been subjected. She had been throttled while held down, the face and head so swollen and distorted in consequence her real features weren't discernible. And that's interesting because the mortuary photograph of Tabor, and the only photograph in existence today, shows her in repose as if she was asleep. Inspector Reed's main hope of cracking the case initially lay in his belief that one of the wounds had been inflicted by a bayonet. And numerous soldiers had been seen drinking around the East End that night, one group in a nearby Princess Alice pub. But the East London Advertiser reported that George Street and some other streets in the immediate vicinity had for years been a regular rendezvous and hiding place for deserters. Rusty bayonets could also be bought from the old iron stalls in Petticoat Lane for about a penny each, and had often been seen being used as playthings in the hand of children. Well, on that note, we've come to the end of today's show. We'll be back and talk a little bit more about some of Jack the Ripper's forgotten victims in tomorrow's show. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great evening.